because this is what you've actually came for, which is Professor Alan Carson talking about how to get published. So Professor Carson has a combined academic and clinical role. He's a consultant neuropsychiatrist in Edinburgh. He also has an editorial board role with the Journal of, I get the end wrong, Neurology, Neurosurgery and Psychiatry. Is that right?
That's right.
Yeah. Alan has gave talks on getting published before, and I found them really useful, and I hope you will too. So, Alan, over to you. And just as a housekeeping thing, we will have time at the end for Q&A. Put your questions in the Q&A box, and then I will ask them to Alan. So I'll stop sharing there, and Alan, it's over to you.
Grand. Now let's see if we can get this to work. It's the new form of performance anxiety for the post-pandemic era. Now, hopefully you can see slides. Somebody shout out if you can't.
We're seeing the presenter view at the moment.
Right, okay. So you're all seeing the presenter view and I am seeing the ordinary view. Let's just try that again. Let's see. How's that? Good.
Oh, it's
right.
But it's went back to the thumbnails of all the slides rather than the single slide.
Does that make a difference when I do that? No?
It's still
thumbnails.
Yeah.
Right. Okay, that's a new one. Let me just see. Let's see what we can do here. Right. Let's put it into that view. Now, hang on. That's not going to work for me. Sorry about this. It's we had a wee test drive before we started in true fashion, and yeah, we got on okay, and now we're not. Third time lucky?
It's still the thumbnails that I'm seeing. I'm
oh,
sorry.
Shit. Right. Okay. Just right. Still, that's not changed. It's still just on thumbnails, is it?
Yeah. Yeah.
Right. Let me see what this does. How about that? Still thumbnails?
Yeah.
Let me just stop this share. Right, okay. I do apologize, everyone. I'm going to shut down the program and just start again and see if
if you want to email me your slide deck, I could.
Just give me one shot at this way of doing it. Let's just see if the old start up and shut down, and then if not, I will send you through the slide deck. Well, considerable apologies, everyone. I thought we were going to be okay. Still not working? Still on thumbnails, Terry?
Yeah.
Okay, I'm very sorry. All right, okay, well, that is annoying, but these things happen.
Yeah, if you email me the slides.
Yeah, I'm just about to.
And then Chris Whitty in the pandemic style, you can just say next slide.
Yeah.
I'll do the necessary.
Right. Hopefully that will come through to you just now. I'll stop sharing this.
Okay, I've got the slides. Bear with me while I get them up. Okay, so if I share, I do this. Can someone tell me, are they seeing?
Well, I'm seeing it fine at my end, although I've been seeing it fine at my end all the way through, so that's maybe not meaningful. Yeah, we're getting a whole load of thumbs up. I think we're good.
Disembodied thumbs are appearing, so I think we're good. Okay.
Great. Okay, next slide. And so just in terms of competing interests, I'm an associate editor with the JNNP. I'm actually president now. I'd updated the slides, but this is a slightly old version of my conflicts. President of the Functional Neurologic Disorder Society. I give independent testimony in court on behalf of a range of bodies, including also World Rugby League. I have very little in the way of pharma funding. My entire career to date has been £500, so it's a bit pathetic. Anyway, next slide. And just skip over that. Next slide. So this is where the JNNP is based. For those of you who are medics, you'll know this as the British Medical Association's rather snappy trade union offices in Tavistock Square. And the BMJ Publishing Group, which is one of the world's largest medical publishing groups, occupies one very large wing. And there are about 80 to 90 journals, an ever-growing stable in the fold, of which, out with the BMJ, JNNP is the highest profit-making journal they have. If we can go to the next slide. This from a few years ago was the editorial group having its annual meeting. Some of the faces, for those of you in neurosciences around the table, will be familiar. Others will be unfamiliar. And you've got a roughly 50-50 mix around this table of medical scientists and publishers. And that's the first strange thing about working in a journal, is that you realize as a clinician scientist, your goals, your aims, your concerns are maybe different from the publisher's concerns. The publishers are in medical publishing to make money, and there's nothing ignoble about that. That's just their role and their job. But it is a slightly different dynamic, whereas most people who come from the scientific side are there for scientific impact. If we can go to the next slide. So just in terms of running a journal, if you're a traditional old school print journal, which most of the major journals are, about half your costs will just go on overheads. Having an establishment, running your base, wherever it is in the world, you've got to have office space to run from, printing presses, etc. You then have the costs of actually printing off your product, sending it out, establishing it on digital forums, etc. You have to pay your editors, at least in some way or kind, unless you've got people working on an entirely voluntary basis. And you have to pay something, at least for promotion although that's a very small cost. Depending on the size and scale of the journal, these costs will vary, but I mean, we're in the midst of trying to set up a digital journal for our FND society. And actually, when you get down to the nitty-gritty for a sort of modern digital only journal, it's not actually that different. You still have to pay a lot for your platform as a percentage of your costs. The further down the sort of impact chain you go, the less the editorial costs tend to be, and there are more people doing it as a labor of love. But ultimately, you're still going to need to pay production staff somewhere. If we could have the next slide. So how do you cover that? Well, again, there will be variance between journals, but for most medium impact and above journals, a large part of the journal revenue is traditional subscription. I think often as scientists trying to get published, we tend not really to think about who are the traditional subscribers to a journal. We more just want to get something in impact, get it out, and we kind of think of, well, it'll be on PubMed, so it doesn't really matter. But just as if you're producing Tatler versus Private Eye, you've got an audience in mind of who buys your product, and the publishers at a journal, and indeed the editors, will think a fair amount about who are the traditional subscribers, who are the people who week in, week out pay to receive this journal through the door, and what are they looking for. And I think when you're choosing a journal, most editorial boards will think in those terms. Who's this journal for? So you do need to think about that and make sure it's a good fit. Consortia deals are a big deal in terms of revenue generation. So, you know, the BMJ group doesn't sell JNNP individually. It wraps it up with a range of its other high-profile journals and goes to university libraries or whatever and says, we will sell you this package. This is what we think it's worth. Librarians, in order to calculate whether that is reasonable or whether they wish to buy this package as opposed to another package, tend to look at impact factor, obviously, but they also look at downloads and social media traffic. So journals nowadays have quite a big eye on their altimetrics and what sort of turnover is generated in social media from individual papers. So if your group has an active social media presence that leads directly to downloads of your work, that is very favorable. Everyone talks about advertising. To be honest, if advertising was removed from journal revenue tomorrow, no one's going to be in panic stations. It's not where the big money is. Where the really big money from drug companies comes from is actually reprints. And the bigger you go in terms of impact, the bigger that slice is. So if you were looking at the Lancet, you would see that about, certainly over a third of the revenue comes from reprints. If you went up to the New England Journal of Medicine, it goes up to about half. So if there is a major landmark clinical trial showing drug X is effective, drug companies will buy huge amounts of reprints at quite high cost to use and give out at conferences for sales reps, etc. And that is big revenue. So, you know, there are certain high-profile journals known as the journals of positive results, and that's partly why it's to do with the economic benefit from drug companies of doing this. But it just gives you a slight sense. Open access fees are an interesting area. About 15 years ago, everyone in publishing was panic-stricken about where open access was leading to. Nobody really seems to care that much. Say something quite controversial, I think open science has been a bit of a failure. I'd say it's a little bit like Brexit. People knew what they felt was wrong with the old model, but they hadn't really thought what they wanted to replace it. And certainly at the business end, you don't have the same sense of impending panic. And it's been a bit of a damp squib, to be absolutely truthful. So, you know, it's interesting, and I'm sure there will be some of you with strong views to the contrary. I'm quite happy to have a debate about it, but that's just my take, looking at it from the more editorial publishing side. I don't think open access and open science has quite delivered what it anticipated. The particular issue being somebody still has to pay, and either the reader pays or the writer pays. The publisher ain't going to pay. You can take that off the table for a starter. So with open access, the big trouble is particularly early career scientists don't have $1,000 or whatever a paper, sometimes up to $6,000 a paper to get published in the first place. So it's not quite the fun-loving, we're all in it together model that it was originally branched as. It's actually a hyper-exclusive model that favors very established research groups. Anyway, that's my little rant. Next slide. So you'll understand from this that journals are businesses. They want to make money. It is not possible to publish science free of charge. Somebody somewhere down the line has to pay, and the arguments are about who's going to pay, how they're going to pay, and how much. But I would also say scientists are pretty ambitious. They want to make money for their departments, and if we're being honest, I would suggest for themselves as well. And high-profile journals make more cash for everyone. But to be high impact, it's got to be something everyone wants to read, and there is the nub of it. So if we have the next slide. So this paper, the SANAD trial, is a classic example of a very high impact paper from the neuroscience world. It was in a date where there was a whole load of new anticonvulsants had come along, and we didn't know which one was best to be used for partial epilepsy. It was a large scale, well-conducted, randomized controlled trial, big numbers on a really interesting question. And the bottom line is this type of study is going to get published in a very high impact journal unless you completely screw it up or literally get your 6-year-old kid to write it. You don't actually have to worry. So, you know, there is no way around it. High quality, large studies will always do well. And I'm not really going to talk about that side. I more want to talk about how to make the best of what you've got, as it were. I'm not really going to talk about how you alter the science. Can we have the next slide? This was also an interesting study. This is more the level that tends to come to JNNP. After the release of SANAD, Keppra came to market, and the question was, well, where does that fit in? It was a popular anticonvulsant, very easy to start acutely in hospital, and really people wanted to find out. And essentially, it copied SANAD, but it used levetiracetam. So again, very nice study. When this sort of thing comes into a journal, even if it's badly written, we will want to try to work with the authors because we can tell it's interesting to get it into shape. So if you get enthusiastic letters back from journals saying, we really want this, we want to publish it, but you know, we want to help you, don't get all snotty about the fact your writing's wonderful. Listen to the advice. People are telling you something you need to hear. We can have the next slide. So what happens to a paper? And I want you just to sort of get the editor's point of view, because that's what it's really all about. It's the editor who's going to look at your paper, and they're going to look at a lot of papers in a week. I'll typically get 10 papers a week to look at, of which about 0.5 of a paper will be accepted to JNNP. So it's how do you try to get your paper to stand out? So the first thing we know, if we can have the next slide, is we get a letter. Dear sir, we want to admit the enclosed version of our article, Daphne, a new tool for diagnosis of behavioral variant FTD. That sounds quite interesting. There's different schools of thought on cover letters and how long you should go. I would keep them very, very short. At the very most, just write what the controversy is that your study solves. If you're writing a 1.5 pages of A4, no one's going to read it. I can tell you now, they'll just cut to the chase. At most, you've got about 1 paragraph to say to people, this is why the study's done. And if you can't sum it up in 1 paragraph, just don't bother. Just write where you have a look at the paper. Don't go into 3-page explanations that people just will not read them, is the bottom line. So we like the title. We think there's a niche in the market. We'll send it out to review. Can we have the next slide? And this is what happens. So we send it out to 5 or 6 reviewers. We get 1 or 2 back. Nowadays, that's one of my main gripes about open science, is no one wants to review, but everyone wants to complain when their papers don't get quickly reviewed. So we now send it out to about 20 people to get 1 reviewer. But reviewers don't often agree. So we have accept, reject. You're saying there's an editor thinking, oh, well, where did I take that? So if we can have the next slide. So review 1 just says I quite like this. It's 3 sentences. Doesn't really tell us very much. Not a terribly helpful review either way. Reviews don't need to be long. I certainly don't need people to spell check. Certainly don't want character vaccinations. I don't want people to tell me that if they'd done the study differently using MRI instead of CT, it would have been much better. But ideal review, about 3/4 of a page, maybe half a page. And I want to know fundamentally, is it interesting? Okay, so the guy has answered that. And I want to know, are the methods reliable? What are the key strengths? What are the key weaknesses? That's really what I would look for in an ideal review, and what areas should be opened up that have been scaped over. So we have the next slide. And then we got another one, but this is, you get the comments to the author, which are saying, you know, this is what the problem is. There's a circularity in the arguments. And actually, is it really any better than what went before? But there's also confidential comments to the editor. And if you're thinking of complaining in terms of you've been rejected and you've looked at the reviews and you think they're not too bad, and you know you could fix everything they're saying, just remember that the confidential comments to the editor may be a bit more brutal. So, you know, really the reason to go for rebuttal is if there's a fundamental misunderstanding. So we ended up rejecting that. But if we can go to the next slide, what you then have when you come to an editorial committee is a range of studies. And you basically want to say, will this study beat all the others? So it might be a funny way of looking at it, but actually getting published is a competitive business. You've got to be slightly better than the other studies that are coming up that week in the editor's minds. That's not an absolute bar, it is a relative bar. It's a bit like being in the savannah and running away from lions. You just need to be faster than the slowest person. Okay, can we have the next slide? So how can you improve your chances? Now, this isn't about making something out of nothing. If the study's poor, it's poor. There's nothing you can do. This is how you can just sort of get over the line if you're in the gray zone between it's unclear whether it's going to be accepted or rejected. So next slide. It's about communication. And that might sound obvious, but the number of poorly written and unclear papers that I see is amazing. And let's start with the title. Simon Wesley, or Professor Sir Simon Wesley, to give him his proper title, had quite an impact on me in an early stage in my career. Used to always say that this was one of the greatest headlines ever written, and it's what every aspiring academic should move towards. And the point he was making is, you know exactly what the story is about. Arguably, there's no need to even bother reading the story. I mean, leaving aside the fact we know it's going to be bollocks, it's all there. Freddie Starr ate my hamster. You know, we've got it in 5 words. It's clear cut what is going to happen. And that is the ideal communication we should strive for, is this very brief clarity and certainty over what is going on. Can we get the next slide, Terry? So think before you submit. Who are you writing for? Does the journal publish the sort of things you write about? Has anything been like it in the journal before? And if it has, for goodness sake, make sure you cite it and mention it. What sort of readership does the journal target? And are they the people who are going to read your paper? And how likely are others to cite your paper? Because that is key. And, you know, if you're writing a cover letter, and this is an extension of a study that was cited 300 times, that is one thing to get into your cover letter. writing style. Do try to remember that technical language obscures communication. And always think, if you're using big words, are you doing it to make yourself sound clever, or are you doing it because it's the only possible way this can be described and the reader needs them? Nobody ever rejected a paper because it was too simply and clearly written. I cannot emphasize that enough. Can we have the next slide? So rule one, first thing I look at is the title and the authors. My dad used to sort of say, you know, life's unfair. You know, don't buy tickets for an amateur orchestra or insurance off a friend, and you won't go far wrong. It is a fact of life that journals have favorite authors, and if these favorite authors submit things, they will get the luck of the draw that you might not. You can rail against that as much as you like, but you're not going to change it. It's a sad fact. You know, I can write something fascinating on Parkinson's. If Tony Lang writes exactly the same article, the journals are going to think everyone will read Tony's version, so they're going to want that. But the title you can do a lot about. And here's 3 examples of titles. They're all about roughly the same thing, which is the topic of depression after stroke. But I'm going to suggest to you that one of these titles is clearly better. Now, I have huge bias because I wrote it, but I'm still going to stand by that comment that depression after stroke and lesion location will stand out against the other 2 in terms of where it's going. We want titles short, we want them pithy, and we want them to be Freddie Starr ate my hamster. We want to know exactly what you got. No one has any doubt what that study is going to tell you from the title alone. Can we get the next slide? So here's a range of titles, and I just want you to read through them all for a minute. This was just the week I happened to be writing the slides. These were the ones in my inbox that I had to choose from. And we chose 2 titles from this group. Both of them got over 100 citations, so they were well chosen. Which 2 would you go for? And if you just have a second to think to yourself, we can't really do it in audience participation terms. So the 2 we chose were post-traumatic amnesia after traumatic brain injury, pitfalls and challenges. Very clear what you're getting, important clinical topic, practical. People are going to have a look at that. And meta-analysis of modifiable risk factors for Alzheimer's disease. Again, it's nice and clear. Some of these other titles, some of them are just very, very niche. Errors analysis and verbal fluency tasks in patients with chronic schizophrenia. That is never going to go into a mainstream journal, however good it is. Posterior atrophy is associated with symptoms of agitation in patients with Alzheimer's disease and mild cognitive impairment. Well, very nice, but again, it's a bit niche. So you got to try and think, if you're going for a general journal with big impact, you got to make your title general, if you see what I mean. Okay, can we have the next slide? So your introducing statement. This was, again, it's about a series of papers on stroke. If I have to read another paper on stroke, which starts by saying stroke involves a da-di-da, it's the second commonest cause of disability in adults over 55 in the industrial world, da-di-da-di-da. Listen, if I'm reading a neurology journal on a paper about stroke, you can take it as read that I know what a stroke is. You don't need to repeat it. It is just dull as mull. Start with what your study's about. So again, from the 3 studies I showed you the title of, here are the opening first lines or first paragraph. And again, just take a second to read them and think which one seems more interesting to you. And I'm going to again suggest, with huge subjective bias, because again, I wrote it, that the first one is the best of the 3. Conflicting evidence on the hypothesis that risk of depression after stroke is influenced by a location of a brain lesion. We undertook a systematic review to examine the hypothesis depression more commonly associated with left hemisphere strokes than right, and with lesions of the left anterior brain than with other regions. That's what you're getting for your money. Whereas if you look at the bottom one, to examine the relation between depressive symptoms, specific cognitive functions with recent stroke, and to examine association, it's just a bit all over the place. It lacks precision. So try to be precise, focused, and disciplined in what you're doing so that people can understand instantly what it is. Go next slide. Now, generally speaking, in scientific writing, you want to have a sort of basic X shape. So you're starting with the wider issue. Depression after stroke, da-di-da-di-da. Here's the thing about lesions. Here's what's been suggested. Here's the controversy. And we're narrowing it down. Here's how we're going to answer it. Here's what we did. Here's what we found. And then we're going to broaden back out to see where's that going to take us next. And more harm is done by over-inclusion than under-inclusion in introductions and discussions. I can't emphasize enough that short and pithy will get you further. Can you have the next slide? Now, the real key to scientific writing, particularly when you start out and you don't sort of have it on automatic habit, is introducing the ideas in the same order in each section. And I tell this to all my research fellows, and they all roll their eyes a bit, and none of them quite believe me, but I insist that they do it. And of course, they all reluctantly do because I'm whining on in their ear, and it'll just be the path of least resistance, but they get surprised when they do. And the idea is this, that normally speaking, we may have 3 or 4 ideas or variables, whatever, in a study that we're looking at. And essentially, the readability will be improved if throughout every section of the paper, the ideas come up in the same order. So if you just take a different highlighter pen, and let's say you're doing a study on dementia, so you've got 3 cognitive measures, I don't know, let's say a verbal fluency, a delayed recall, and, oh Christ, what, I don't know, I can't think of anything, a clock drawing. These should always, every section they're mentioned, they should always come up in that order, if you see what I mean. And if we're relating it to imaging, it should always go in the same way. So just highlight the ideas and the variables as they come, and just check that you've got a nice repeating set of stripes through your paper, rather than a sort of smorgasbord of patches of ideas. And if you start to rewrite it to the point that you get that, it will be far, far more readable and far easier to understand. Can you get the next slide? Now, do remember that some poor sod has to read the thing that you've written. So, here's from one of these studies, which I was saying is a bit problematic. Post-stroke depression generally has a chronic course, contributes to a variety of adverse health outcomes, including increased disability, mortality, morbidity. Systematic review indicate depressive symptom present in 1/3 of all states. Prospective cohort study incident, blah, 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 blah. Where's it going? What's that about? So try and get somebody to read your work. And if they don't understand it straight away, they may be thick, but it's still your fault. And if they get bored reading it, take note of that. That's your fault too. And if you just give it to your mum and she says, oh, it's lovely, that's not really helpful. You need criticism, and you actually need quite harsh criticism with somebody who's going to be honest, because if you get harsh criticism within your department that picks your paper to bits and rewrites it for you, that's what the reviewers aren't going to do to you, if you see what I mean. So, just take it on the chin and try to learn. And it is upsetting. I can still remember the first paper I ever sent to Charles Warlow as a young researcher, and it came back covered in red ink. And then when he hadn't had enough with red ink, he went on to green. I was utterly devastated and thought of giving up, but I actually realized that that's how it is. And that's how it needs to be to really learn. So, try to learn from it. Don't see it as people being destructive. It is criticism for a reason. Okay, next slide. And don't pretend there's controversy where there isn't. I read so many papers where people try to generate some idea of controversy that simply isn't there on some hair-splittingly fine niche. And it just generally does not help. So be honest and just say, and if the paper's replication, there is nothing at all wrong with saying this is a really important finding, change the way we think, it's never been replicated, we need to replicate it. Then people know what it is, and that's worthwhile in its own right. Okay, next slide. One of the ways journals advertise is by scientists using their slides in presentations. So you'll find that all journals offer essentially a PowerPoint slide maker, because it's the way we get stuff out there. So whenever you're presenting your results, you want to have your key take-home slide. So when our research fellows are preparing a paper, the thing I'm saying to them is, what's going to be the slide from this paper that other people are going to show in a conference? And if there isn't one, make one. And use your ingenuity, even if it's a small infographic or something. But you want to have a one-slide take-home message that people can really see. Next slide. Avoid to the best of. You're either right or wrong. So just say it. This was the first longitudinal study to investigate the relationship in frontal lobe infarction and course of depression with first ever ischemic stroke. If you're right, you're right. If you're wrong, you're not less wrong because you say to the best of our knowledge. You're still going to get corrected. So just avoid it. But primacy doesn't really help that much. Can we have the next slide? So this was an example, just again following this depression after stroke, of a study by Robert Robinson and Hopkins. We've got a context. Depression occurs in more than half the patients experienced a stroke. Post-stroke depression has been shown in numerous studies to be associated with both impaired recovery and activity of daily living and increased mortality. Prevention thus represents a potentially important goal. Nice context, clear, we know what we're getting. An objective, to determine whether treatment with escitalopram problem-solving therapy over the first year following acute stroke will decrease the number of depression cases that develop compared to placebo medication. Again, nice and clear. Then got a clear of how they're going to do it. And can we have the next slide? And you've got to match the aims with the conclusions. You'll be amazed how often the aims say one thing and the conclusions don't match. So that's our context and our objective. Can we have the next slide? We've been through what that was. In conclusion, this study has demonstrated post-stroke depression can be effectively prevented in a significant number of patients by administering escitalopram or by problem-solving therapy. So it's all clear and it all lines up. And note that the order remains the same. So in each stage, they have escitalopram first and problem-solving therapy second. And these small things really make the difference. Have the next slide. So I meant to add one other thing, a word about acronyms. So changing the slide set, I missed it out. Do not use any acronyms in your paper that are not in routine usage clinically. So MRI, EEG, ECG are all fine. But if you're making up a shorthand acronym to describe some complex group, Alzheimer's patients with new onset depression, and you call them APNOD, as an acronym, it is disastrous to read. Just say depressed patients, say it first full and then put in brackets afterwards, we will refer to them as depressed patients or something. It just helps the readability. So to get published, it's really quite simple. Do a good study, clearly describe its context, its aims, its methods, its results and conclusions. And if it's that straightforward, I've got to ask the question why less than half the people who send papers for me to read actually manage to do it. Can you get the next slide? So that's it. Over to Q&A.